What would it take for a family to stay awake night after night, armed, on the roof of their own home, and then carry that memory quietly for years? Not talking about it at work, not turning it into a story, not asking for attention, just living with it. That question sits at the center of what happened on one rural farm in Ohio during the summer of 1981. Not because the events were loud or public, but because they unfolded slowly, privately, and without a clear ending. This is not a story built to reach a conclusion. It is a preserved account. What follows is not an argument, and it is not an attempt to explain the unexplainable. The events did not happen in a single night, or even over a single week. They stretched across an entire summer. They changed shape, intensity, and rhythm as time passed. The only goal here is to document what was reported in the order it was experienced and leave it where it stands. The setting was rural Ohio, a small family farm surrounded by fields, woods, and long stretches of quiet road. This was 1981. No internet. No cell phones. No way to record something quickly or share it widely. If something strange happened, you either told a neighbor or you kept it to yourself. Most people chose the second option. Life moved at a steady pace there, and routine mattered. That routine is where this story begins. The farm belonged to Robert and his family. It was not large, and it was not unusual for the area. A farmhouse, a barn, fenced land, and animals that needed attention every day. Chickens, ducks, and a few larger animals that helped keep the place running. The work started early and ended late, depending on the season. Nothing about the property stood out to outsiders. Most days followed the same pattern. Animals were fed in the morning. Fences were checked. Repairs were handled when something broke, usually with whatever tools were already on hand. In the evenings, the family stayed close to the house. There were no nearby towns with much to do, and they were used to that. Quiet was normal. Silence did not feel strange. Neighbors were spread out, but not distant in the social sense. People knew who lived where. They noticed unfamiliar vehicles. They talked when they crossed paths, usually about weather, crops, or work. No one locked their doors during the day. At night, things were closed up more out of habit than fear. This was the kind of place where nothing unexpected was supposed to happen. The woods around the property were thick in places, thinner in others. Deer moved through regularly. Coyotes were known to pass through from time to time. That was part of living there. Sounds carried at night, especially in summer, but most of them were familiar. An animal moving through brush, wind in the trees, the occasional engine on a distant road. Robert had lived with this routine for years. He knew the land, the animals, and the patterns of the place. When something was out of order, he usually noticed quickly. But at the start of that summer, there was no sense of danger, no feeling that things were changing. The farm was doing what it had always done. It was simply being a farm. Nothing had happened yet. No warnings, no signs. Just another season beginning the same way all the others had before it. The first changes were easy to dismiss. Animals on the farm began acting differently, but not in a way that immediately caused alarm. Dogs hesitated near the tree line. Chickens settled earlier than usual. Ducks stayed closer to the pond instead of wandering. None of this felt dramatic. Animals behave oddly for many reasons, especially in summer. Heat, predators, changes in weather. Robert noticed it, but he did not dwell on it. Not long after that, Robert found a deer near the edge of his property. It had been killed, but not in a way he recognized. No drag marks leading into the woods. The body had been opened, but the damage did not match what he had seen from coyotes or dogs in the past. he had hunted for years. He knew what scavengers usually left behind. This looked different, but different does not always mean unknown. He assumed another animal had done it and moved on. Around this same time, a group of Amish men came to the property to cut timber. This was not unusual. They had worked in the area before and were familiar faces. When they returned one morning, the feed bags had been torn open and scattered. Grain covered the ground. There were no clear tracks, and nothing appeared to be taken. The men cleaned up and continued working. No one made much of it. A few days later, Robert noticed one of the Amish horses had a long wound along its side. The men said it was nothing serious. They mentioned snakes and brush and tried to downplay it. Robert did not push the issue. People working with animals often avoid overthinking injuries. Accidents happen. Still, the mood shifted slightly. Small conversations grew shorter. Tools were packed a little earlier in the day. Then, without explanation, the Amish stopped coming. Their equipment remained on the property, untouched. Days passed. Then weeks. When they finally returned, it was only to collect what they had left behind. No explanation was offered. No arguments. No warning. They simply came back, loaded their tools, and left. In rural places, people rarely explain why they leave. They just do. Neighbors were told about the deer and the feed bags. The response was the same each time. Coyotes. Dogs. Bad luck. Summer brings predators closer to farms. Most people in the area had seen similar things at some point. Nothing sounded alarming enough to involve authorities or outsiders. Reporting something unusual carries a cost. It can change how people see you. It can make neighbors cautious, or worse, dismissive. In rural communities, problems are handled quietly. People wait to see if something repeats before they speak up. One strange event is an accident. Two is coincidence. It takes time before anyone is willing to say something does not fit. At this stage, nothing had crossed that line. Everything still had an explanation, even if those explanations felt thin. Looking back, this period matters because it shows how slowly concern builds. There was no moment when the family said something was wrong. Instead, small things stacked up, one after another, without demanding attention. Each event on its own could be ignored. Together, they created a pattern that would only make sense later. By early summer, work began on a gas line connected to a small well on the property. This kind of work was common in the area and did not draw much attention. Heavy equipment moved through parts of the woods that were not usually disturbed. Trees were cleared where needed. Soil was turned. Engines ran for hours at a time. Robert paid attention to the progress, but treated it like any other project. It was loud, inconvenient, and temporary. No one involved reported anything unusual during the first days of work, and the operation moved forward as planned. During this work, a bulldozer operator came across something that stopped him. In a section of the woods, he found a patch of ground roughly 40 feet across that looked wrong. There was no grass, no rocks, no visible roots. The soil was smooth and gray, as if it had been scraped clean long before the equipment arrived. In that cleared area were two large holes. Each one was wide enough that a person could stand inside them. They went straight down into the ground. The operator pointed it out, mentioned it casually, and said he was hired to dig through land, not around it. He drove straight over the area and continued his work. No photographs were taken. No measurements were recorded. No explanation was offered at the time. After the machinery moved on, Robert went to look at the area himself. The clear patch was still visible. The holes were still there. There were no signs marking the spot, and no indication that the gas work had created them. They did not resemble test pits or drilling marks he was familiar with. There was no debris piled nearby, no broken equipment. The ground around them showed no clear tracks leading in or out. He did not attempt to dig into them or cover them. He stood there, noted what he saw, and left. Nothing in his experience told him what the area was supposed to be, but nothing demanded immediate action either. What matters about this discovery is not what it meant, but how it was handled. It was seen, it was mentioned. Then it was ignored. In rural work, unexplained ground features are not uncommon. Old wells, collapsed soil, forgotten projects. People learn to step around them and move on. No reports were filed. No officials were called. No one returned to study the site later. As far as records show, the clear patch and the holes were never formally documented. They existed briefly in conversation, then faded into the background. Another strange detail added to a summer that was beginning to feel unsettled, but still manageable. By mid-June, animals on the farm began to go missing. At first, it was small losses. A duck did not return to the pond. A chicken failed to come back to the coop at dusk. This was not unheard of. Predators took livestock every year, and usually the remains were never found. Robert counted the losses, made a note of them, and kept going. There was still nothing that forced him to stop and call it a problem. Then some of the animals turned up. The bodies were found not far from the house, close enough that someone had to be looking to notice them. The heads were gone. The bodies had been opened cleanly, not torn apart or scattered. There was no blood trail leading into the woods, no mess that suggested a struggle. Robert buried them quietly. He did not bring the family out to look. He did not tell neighbors. He told himself it was better not to make a situation out of something he could not explain. Around the same time, he noticed the pile of sawdust near the house that had not been there before. It was not from recent work. It looked as though something had dug into it, disturbed it, and left it behind. It sat close enough to the building to be noticed during daily chores. Robert stood over it longer than he meant to. Then he kicked some of it aside and went back to what he was doing. These were small things, but they were getting closer. The most unsettling moment came not from the land or the animals, but from inside the house. One night, Robert's 16-year-old son woke up screaming. He was shaking, convinced that he had seen a face pressed against his bedroom window. He described eyes, breath on the glass, a shape too close to be imagined. The family calmed him down and told him it was a nightmare. Teenagers have vivid dreams, stressed as that. The explanation was accepted because it needed to be. Still, the memory lingered. The window was checked. The yard outside was scanned the next morning. Nothing was found. No marks, no footprints, no sign anyone or anything had been there. The family moved on, but the house felt different after that. Sounds at night carried more weight. Windows stayed closed longer. Lights were left on a little later than usual. At this stage, denial was not stubbornness, it was survival. Accepting that something was wrong meant admitting they did not have control over their own space. It meant opening the door to fear that had no clear solution. In a rural setting, being seen as unstable can isolate you faster than any physical danger. People talk, reputations stick. Robert chose silence, not because he believed nothing was happening, but because he hoped it would stop if left alone. Hesitation defined this period. Every explanation was stretched as far as it could go. Coyotes, stray dogs, bad luck, dreams, coincidences. Each new incident pushed those explanations closer to breaking, but they had not broken yet. The farm was still standing. The family was still safe. For now, that was enough to keep going, even as the line between outside and inside began to thin. The night it changed, Robert was awake. It was late, past the hour when the farm usually settled into stillness. The ducks by the pond began making noise, not the normal rustling or soft calls, but frantic movement. Wings slapped against the water. The sound carried across the yard in sharp bursts. Robert stood up and went to the door without thinking much about it. His mind was still searching for ordinary reasons. He stepped outside with a flashlight and moved toward the pond. The beam cut through the dark in a narrow line, catching grass, fence posts, and the edge of the trees. The ducks were pressed together, splashing and shifting, as if something had entered the water with them. Robert raised the light toward the tree line. At first, he saw nothing. Then the beam caught a pair of red points in the darkness. They did not move. They were set too high off the ground to belong to any animal he knew. For a moment, Robert froze. He adjusted the angle of the flashlight, thinking it might be a reflection. The red points remained fixed. The shape behind them was unclear, heavy, and wrong in a way that made his chest tighten. He called out without meaning to, more out of habit than bravery. There was no response. The ducks thrashed harder. His heart began to race. He raised the gun and fired. The shot echoed across the field and into the trees. What came back was not a growl or the sound of something running away on all fours. It was a scream. High, sharp, and long enough to make his ears ring. The shape stumbled, then moved fast, crossing the field away from the pond. As it ran, it did not drop to the ground. It stood upright. Robert watched it retreat on two legs, taller than any person he had ever seen moving that quickly. The noise faded into the woods. The field went quiet again, except for the ducks settling back into the water. Robert stood there breathing hard, the flashlight shaking in his hand. His sons came out behind him, drawn by the gunshot. He did not try to explain what he had seen. He did not have words for it. They stood together in the yard for a long time, listening for something to come back. Nothing did. That night, no one slept. The house lights stayed on. Every sound from outside drew attention. The usual noises of summer felt sharper, closer. A branch snapping in the woods sounded deliberate. Wind against the siding felt like movement. The gun was placed within reach, not locked away as it usually was. By morning, exhaustion had replaced fear, but the fear never left completely. From that night on, routines changed. Doors were checked more than once. Windows were watched instead of ignored. Weapons stayed closer, not because the family believed they would help, but because doing nothing felt worse. Sleep came in short stretches, broken by listening. The farm was still there, but it no longer felt empty at night. Something had crossed the distance between the woods and the house, and once that line was crossed, it could not be drawn back. The next night did not wait for darkness to feel heavy. Sleep came in short pieces, and when it broke hard. Sometime after midnight, the dog began barking outside. At first it sounded normal, sharp, and alert. Then it changed. The barking stopped mid-sound and turned into a whimper. Low, strained, and frightened. That sound pulled Robert out of his chair and into the hallway before he had time to think. He grabbed the flashlight and stepped onto the porch. The yard looked the same as it always had. Grass moving slightly in the night air. The beam found the dog near the back of the house. It was pressed low to the ground, trying to dig its way under the push mower. Its tail was tucked tight. When Robert called its name, it did not look up. It did not move. That alone felt wrong. Then Robert heard breathing. Not fast or panicked, but slow and heavy, close enough to feel. He turned the flashlight toward the farm hoist near the barn. The beam climbed the wooden frame, catching the crossbar near the top. Something stood beside it. The shape filled the space without effort. The top beam of the hoist was about 12 feet off the ground. The head of the figure reached close to it, not touching, but close enough to measure without guessing. Robert did not try to study it. He did not look for details. He knew the size because he had built the hoist himself. He knew the distance because it stood still. The smell reached in next. Wet hair, rust, and something sharp that reminded him of burned metal. It was not overwhelming, but it was real. The presence of it pressed against his chest, making it hard to breathe. For a few seconds, neither of them moved. The flashlight beam shook, but Robert kept it raised. The figure tilted slightly, not aggressive, not retreating. Then it stepped back, slow and deliberate, and disappeared into the darkness behind the barn. There was no sound of it running away, just absence where something large had been. Robert shouted for his sons. They came out armed and wide awake. He told them where it had stood. No one argued. No one laughed. They checked the yard together, staying close. Nothing was there. The dog stayed under the mower until morning. The hoist stood untouched. The night passed without another sound. From that point on, something changed in the house. No one called it an animal anymore. No one corrected each other or offered explanations. They did not name it. They did not talk about what it might be. The certainty did not come from seeing it again, but from realizing that whatever it was had chosen to stand there and be seen. That was enough to break the last explanation they had been holding on to. Later that night, the family did not stay inside. When movement was seen near the tree line again, Robert and his sons made a decision they had not planned on making. They got into the pickup truck and drove toward the woods. The headlights cut across the field, and for a brief moment, they caught a tall shape moving along the edge of the trees. It stayed just ahead of the light, never fully visible, but clearly there. The truck followed, slow at first, then faster, gravel snapping under the tires as they moved down the road. They lost sight of it near a neighbor's driveway. A car sat idling there, lights on, as if someone had been waiting. Robert stopped and asked if the neighbor had seen anything. The man said no, but his voice did not sound certain. He stood with his hands in his pockets, looking past the truck toward the woods. Nothing more was said. The family turned back toward home, windows down, listening as they drove. Halfway back, the truck died. There was no warning, no sputter. The engine simply cut out, and the headlights went dark. The road went silent. Robert turned the key. Nothing happened. For a moment, no one spoke. The dark felt thicker without the sound of the engine. Then something brushed against the side of the truck. Not a strike, not a hit. Just pressure, slow and heavy, dragging along the metal. One of the boys started breathing fast, trying not to cry. Robert turned the key again. The engine roared to life on its own. The headlights came back on. He did not wait. He drove straight home, faster than before. No one looked out the windows. When they reached the house, they sat in the truck until morning, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. In the light of day, the truck showed no problems. The fuel line was intact. The battery worked. There was no reason it should have stopped. That mattered more than the shutdown itself. Machines fail all the time, but unexplained failure carries weight. In moments of fear, people rely on tools to give them distance and speed. When those tools stop working, control disappears. Later that day, another neighbor admitted something small but important. His sons had stopped camping in their backyard weeks earlier. They said they had seen something large moving near the trees at night. He had told them it was a bear. Saying it out loud made it sound reasonable. But now, after hearing Robert's account, he did not repeat the explanation. Mechanical failure changes how fear settles in. It removes options. It traps people where they are. After that night, the family understood that leaving quickly might not always be possible. The farm was not just where the events were happening. It was where they might have to face them without escape. After that night, sleep stopped being a priority. It became something taken in turns when exhaustion finally won. Someone was always awake. Someone was always listening. The family stopped reacting to sounds and started waiting for them instead. Chairs were moved closer to windows. Porch lights stayed on. Weapons were kept loaded, not because anyone believed they would solve the problem, but because standing unarmed felt worse. The shift was quiet but clear. Before, they had gone outside only when something forced them to. Now, they watched the yard even when nothing was happening. They took positions where they could see the tree line, the pond, the barn. Night after night, they stayed still, scanning the same spaces, learning the shape of the darkness. Familiar sounds became markers: crickets, wind, distant engines. Anything new stood out immediately. It was during these long watches that the lights first appeared. They were far off at first, hovering above the trees. Small points of color that did not blink like aircraft lights and did not move like reflections. They made no sound. They did not cast beams. They simply stayed there, suspended, then drifted slowly before fading out. No one spoke when they appeared. No one tried to explain them. The lights did not come every night. That made them worse. When they appeared, there was no warning. When they vanished, there was no sign they had been there at all. The family learned to keep track of time without clocks, marking hours by fatigue instead of numbers. The watches stretched on. Dawn became a relief rather than a routine. What mattered most during this period was the change in mindset. Fear had settled into something steadier, less panic, more tension. They were no longer waiting to be surprised. They were waiting to see what would happen next. Defense replaced reaction, even though no one could say what they were defending against. No one said the word animal anymore. No one said anything else either. Speculation felt dangerous. Giving something a name made it real in a way they were not ready to face. The lights remained unexplained. They were observed, noted, and remembered, but not discussed beyond what could be confirmed by more than one person. The farm at night became a place of stillness and attention. Nothing dramatic had to happen for the tension to build. The act of watching itself became exhausting. By the time the sun came up each morning, the family was worn down, not from action, but from waiting. Whatever had entered their world was no longer hiding in the distance. It was being acknowledged silently, night after night. By late June, the family understood they could not keep carrying the situation alone. The strain had become visible in small ways. Sleep was broken into short stretches. Conversations stopped halfway through. Silence settled in places where routine used to be. That was when Dennis arrived. He was not law enforcement and did not present himself as an authority. He described himself as someone who collected accounts and documented unusual reports. He did not arrive with answers or explanations, and he did not claim to know what was happening. His role was simple: observe what could be observed, write down what was said, leave with the record intact. Dennis listened more than he spoke. He asked the family to describe events in their own words and in the order they remembered them. He did not interrupt when details repeated or contradicted each other. He wrote everything down. For the first time since the events began, the family felt they were being taken seriously without being pushed toward a conclusion. That mattered. Being heard did not solve anything, but it eased the pressure that had been building inside the house. During the day, Dennis walked the property slowly. He followed the fence line and stopped where damage had been reported. Sections of barbed wire had been bent and twisted apart. The posts were still firmly in the ground. The wire had not been cut or snapped. It looked as though something had pulled on it and then let go. Dennis measured the spacing and photographed the damage. No explanation was recorded at the time. It was noted as it appeared and nothing more. In the open fields, Dennis found footprints. They were round impressions with 3 distinct toes, spaced farther apart than would be expected from known animals. Some tracks crossed open ground and then stopped suddenly. There were no marks showing where the maker turned or changed direction. The impressions simply ended. Plaster casts were taken. Distances were written down. The findings were recorded without interpretation. Near the barn and along the edge of the woods, there were areas where grass had been pressed flat into circular shapes. In some places, the blades were twisted rather than crushed. The soil beneath was compacted and hard. No one could say when those impressions had first appeared. They were photographed and logged as part of the record. Nothing more was added to them. What shifted during this period was not the activity itself, but the number of people who witnessed it. Dennis and others present saw the lights on multiple nights. They observed movement near the tree line. They heard sounds that did not behave like normal night noise. Accounts were written separately and compared later. In several cases, descriptions matched without coordination. That consistency was noted, not explained. Dennis remained careful in his approach. Physical evidence often creates the illusion of answers. Footprints, broken fencing, and impressions can confirm that something happened, but they do not explain why it happened or what caused it. Evidence shows presence, not purpose. Dennis did not speculate. He recorded observations and left conclusions open. After several nights, Dennis packed his notes, recordings, and casts and left the farm. That had always been his intention. He told the family to keep documenting anything else that occurred and to contact him if activity increased. He did not promise solutions. He did not offer protection. His role ended where observation ended. When he left, the farm felt quieter, not safer. The family had confirmation that others had seen what they saw, but confirmation did not bring relief. It only made the lack of answers heavier. The nights that followed settled into a pattern that felt heavier than anything before. The lights appeared first. They hovered above the trees, not bright enough to light the ground, but clear enough to be seen without effort. They did not blink or sweep the area. They stayed still, then drifted slowly, changing position without sound. Sometimes there was more than one. Sometimes there was only a single point hanging in the dark. No one spoke while watching them. Talking felt like it might draw attention. The family watched in silence, counting time by how long the lights remained before fading out. After the lights came movement, not rushing, not sudden. Shapes along the edge of the woods shifted and stopped. Something crossed behind trees and paused, then crossed again farther down the line. It never came fully into the open at first. The movement stayed just far enough back to be frustrating. The family took turns calling out directions, pointing, losing sight, then finding it again. Coordination slipped as fatigue set in. Someone would move when another said to stay still. Someone else would miss what the other saw. No one was fully rested, and it showed. Then came the approach. It did not happen all at once. The distance closed in small steps. A shape would leave the tree line and stop near the field. Another would move closer to the barn. Each time someone raised a weapon, the movement changed direction or stopped completely. Ammunition became a constant thought. Every shot carried weight. There was no resupply, no backup. The family argued quietly about when to fire and when to wait. Fear of wasting shells competed with fear of letting something get closer. Decisions were made fast and second-guessed immediately. At one point, movement reached the edge of the yard. Someone fired. The response was sound, not retreat. Screams echoed back from the dark, sharp and loud enough to rattle nerves. Then the shapes pulled away. They did not run in panic. They withdrew with control, slipping back into the woods in pieces rather than all at once. The lights above the trees faded shortly after. The yard went still again, except for breathing and the sound of spent shells hitting the ground. What followed was not relief. It was collapse. Hands shook. Arguments flared over small things. Who should have watched which side? Who fired first? Who hesitated too long? The family regrouped, but the coordination they had relied on earlier was breaking down. Stress made every decision feel wrong. They stayed awake until morning, not because they expected another approach, but because none of them trusted the quiet that followed. By dawn, the siege had passed, but nothing felt finished. The withdrawal did not feel like defeat or victory. It felt deliberate, as if whatever had been watching had learned what it wanted to learn and stepped back on its own terms. The family stood in the yard as the light returned, surrounded by empty space, trying to understand how something could come so close and then leave without warning. The peak had passed, but the sense of being tested stayed behind. After the peak nights, things did not stop. They changed shape instead. The activity thinned out rather than ending cleanly. There were fewer sounds, fewer movements, fewer moments that forced immediate reaction. The lights still appeared from time to time, but not with the same frequency or intensity. When they did appear, they stayed farther back and vanished more quickly. Nothing came close to the yard the way it had before. The pressure eased, but it never fully lifted. Encounters became shorter and less direct. A shape at the tree line that disappeared the moment it was noticed. A light that showed itself once and did not return that night. Sounds that began and ended without building into anything else. Each incident felt incomplete, like the start of something that never finished. That uncertainty settled deeper than the earlier chaos. There was no clear signal that the situation had resolved. This pattern is often reported in long-running cases. Activity tapers instead of stopping outright. Whatever tension has built does not release all at once. People remain alert long after events fade. The family continued their watches, even as the nights grew quieter. They did not trust the silence. Silence had already proven that it could hide things. Near the end of the summer, one final effort was made to document what was happening. A trap was set, not as a challenge or confrontation, but as a way to observe a response. Live animals were used as bait, secured with heavy cord rated far beyond what an animal should be able to break. Recording equipment was prepared. Observers took positions and waited without speaking. Nothing happened for hours. During the night, red eyes appeared in the woods. Several sets at once. They did not rush toward the trap or circle it. They stayed back and watched. No movement followed. By morning, one of the animals was gone. Another was missing. The cord had not been untied or loosened. It had been snapped clean through. The soil around the site showed deep impressions. No tracks led away. No sounds had been heard during the night. There was no sense of triumph. No one claimed proof. What remained was damage and absence. Something had taken what it wanted without being seen. That moment marked the last incident recorded in detail. After that, activity faded into scattered moments and then into nothing that could be clearly documented again. When the summer ended, the farm did not return to what it had been before. Daily routines changed in quiet ways. Animals were kept closer to the house. Certain areas of the land were avoided altogether. Work was done quickly, without wandering or unnecessary movement. The woods were no longer neutral ground. They became something to pass by, not move into. Over time, parts of the property were left unused. Fences fell into disrepair. The barn saw less activity. Visitors stopped asking questions because answers were no longer offered. The family did not leave immediately, but the farm was never lived in the same way again. Silence became the rule rather than the exception. Stories like this often end with noise or confrontation. This one did not. It ended in distance, routine changes, and decisions made without explanation. The cost was not just fear. It was the slow loss of ease in a place that had once felt safe. Cases like this resist explanation because they do not behave like isolated events. They involve animals, lights, sounds, physical traces, and human responses that do not align into a single category. When multiple types of phenomena appear together, they complicate each other. Explaining one part does not explain the whole. Documentation matters more than answers in these situations. Notes, measurements, recordings, and timelines preserve what happened without forcing it into a familiar shape. Answers tend to simplify. Records do not. They leave space for uncertainty, which is often closer to reality than certainty. Silence often follows events like this because speaking keeps them active. Talking invites judgment, disbelief, and endless questioning. For many people, it is easier to carry the memory quietly than to defend it repeatedly. Silence becomes a form of control when nothing else feels controllable. The farm is quiet now. The fields have changed. The woods have grown back where equipment once passed through. Nothing marks the places where people stayed awake through the night watching the tree line. There is no sign that anything unusual ever happened there. What remains are records, notes, and testimony. Fragments of a summer that never settled into a clear explanation. No resolution was reached. No conclusion held. Nothing about what happened that summer fits neatly into a category. And maybe that's the point. If you've listened this far, you don't have to decide what it was. You only have to decide whether these accounts deserve to be remembered. The farm went quiet, but nothing about that summer was ever explained. What remains are records and memories. If you have thoughts about what this siege was, share them in the comments. And let me know where you're watching from.